Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and today I want to talk a little bit about Superman and this perception that he's difficult to write. And I say it's a perception, it does seem to be the case because there are so few really beloved Superman comic stories. A lot of people look at Superman and say he's a great ideal, and I get why he's important, but there's not a lot of great stories that I can sink my teeth into. And the ones that you think of tend to be standalone stories, they tend to be origin stories, they tend to be things that don't count in the main continuity, and the most popular continuity comic book Superman story, and this I think is really telling, is Death of Superman, which isn't about Superman so much as it is about the world losing him. So we had to take Superman out before people really appreciated a story about Superman. That's really interesting. That's really telling to me. So, but I say it's a perception because I don't know that it has to be the case. I think Superman is inherently a really interesting character, and it might sound a little bit conceited of me to be like, it's not that hard, guys. How come we don't have more good Superman stories? Why don't you just hand me a notebook and I'll write you one? I don't know if I could write Superman. I don't know if I could do any better than anybody else could, but on paper anyway, conceptually, Superman seems to be in my mind, kind of tragic character in a way. Good Superman stories tend to be more about internal conflict than external conflict. This is a guy who is supposed to be the ideal. It's difficult, if you're Superman, to balance your personal life and your superhero life, and I think he's the ultimate example of that. And of course, a lot of the themes that we tend to tell in superhero stories begin with Superman. Really, classic tales about trying to be the hero, but also having a personal life, about how important it is to have human beings in your life that you care about while you're also stopping crimes and saving people, so that you have a foundation, so that you have a sense of perspective, and you remember why you're doing this. You can't just go around saving people all the time, or you'll lose touch with reality, and that's when you get into superhero stories about characters who become kind of totalitarian, where like Superman Doomsday attempted this, the movie based on Death of Superman in '07, where you have a clone of Superman who thinks he's a good guy and doing the right things, but it becomes more about him creating the perfect world based on what he thinks is supposed to be right, than it is actually upholding freedoms and the American way and all of that. So I want to go through what I think are the three main reasons that Superman seems to be difficult to write, and discuss ways around them and how he might actually be an easier character to make compelling than we think he is, but also to talk about why that is absolutely true in a lot of cases. So the first big thing is Superman is too powerful. You hear this all the time. Superman is not relatable because he's not like us. Batman is more relatable because he is a human being, and even though he's a rich guy, and most of us don't have the kind of massive tragedy in his past that he has, at least he's mortal. At least bullets can wound him. Batman is compelling because he's a guy who's trying to become the ultimate physical and intellectual specimen. He's pushing the boundaries of his own humanity. And for Superman, that is effortless. He's already beyond the boundaries of humanity because he wasn't born here, and the sun gives him amazing powers. So the argument you hear a lot from people, and I guess I'm talking about why people find Superman is not compelling as much as I'm talking about why it's difficult to write Superman stories, but I think those things go hand in hand, right? It's hard to write those stories because it's hard to get people on board with Superman as a relatable character. So, and a lot of early Superman stories were more about like setting an example and creating a creating an action fantasy, an adventure fantasy. So it was less about like this character being relatable to people and more about people wanting to live up to that character. And it was escapist. It was fun to pretend to be something that you could never actually be, and to constantly shoot for that ideal. And people think that that's old-fashioned and impossible to get people on board with anymore. And so I don't know how true that is, but I guess I want to argue that Superman can still be a relatable character, that it doesn't have to just be escapist stories, even though some of those can be wonderful and neat, and I think there's still a place in our society for those. But anyway, so the Superman is too powerful argument. It's true, it is difficult to make a character like that relatable because it seems like he can get anything he wants without too much difficulty, right? It's hard to... Every story has to go to the nines with external conflict to put anything up against Superman so that he's struggling at all. So there's a conflict, right? So the way around that, of course, is what John Byrne did, which is, well, take some of the extreme of the power away. He didn't actually get rid of any specific powers, but he lessened those powers. So Superman could no longer juggle planets, and then you get things like Superman American Alien, where, at least early on, he can't even go into space. He can't make it through the atmosphere. So he's got the same powers, but you limit them. You make it so that he can bleed. You make it so that he isn't completely impenetrable to everything, and you make it so that you don't need a cop-out MacGuffin device in order to beat him. And that tends to work pretty well. I don't know that Superman has to be indestructible. However, when he is supremely powerful or close to supremely powerful, I think that's when internal conflicts for Superman can be really interesting. And the difficulty becomes less, to me, making a great Superman story, and more doing it on a continuous basis in ongoing comics or on an ongoing television show. The hard thing is serialized stories with Superman, in my mind, before it's telling a good singular story, which is why I'm suggesting that so many beloved Superman stories stand on their own and are kind of in their own continuities, or aren't informed too much by anything else that is going on in regular DC continuity. So stories like All-Star Superman and Superman Red Son and even JMS's Superman Earth 1, and how many, again, stories that everybody remembers from Superman are origins. It's weird because it like I talked about in my origin video, the Superman origin feels like one of those that is kind of just a getting the ball rolling origin. There certainly can be a story there, but it doesn't immediately scream you have to start there. And yet we do so often, and I think a lot of that is because, well, some of it's Donner, right? Some of it is Richard Donner made a big epic out of Superman that is in 3 acts and is almost a vignette film in Alien Origins, and then Smallville, and then today. So I don't know, Superman has always been a serialized character, but maybe inherently he's not. Maybe we are more interested in the overarching story of Superman than we are in seeing him constantly have a bunch of different adventures. But again, I still think you can give Superman different adventures. I think it's just a lot easier to tell one-off story that isn't connected to anything else. And I'll get to some of those different sorts of stories here in a minute, but getting back to the is Superman so powerful question, or how do you deal with a supremely powerful Superman? Again, you make him kind of tragic. You make it difficult for him to live up to the ideal. He is a human being in his heart. He is human in the sense that he has all of the same emotional vulnerabilities and the spiritual difficulties that human beings have, even though he was born on another planet. Essentially, Kryptonians are just humans that have slightly different physiology that can be affected by a yellow sun if they happen to go to a planet that has one. And so the only thing that makes Superman special, besides the fact that he is willing to adopt humanity as his own and to be selfless and to not take over, even though he so easily could, is his superpowers. And so you have to tell us stories about Superman where what's special about him is not his powers. What's exciting about him is not his powers. It's what he chooses to do with them or what he chooses not to do with them. And you have to constantly put Superman in scenarios where he has an easy way out, but if he uses it, there are dire consequences. And I think you just have to tell human stories, Clark Kent sometimes centered stories where having the abilities he has, being godlike, but not mentally being a god, not feeling like he's a god, not thinking he should be. He has to figure out some other way to deal with his problems. And I love ethical conundrums with Superman where, who do I save? I am mortal in the sense that I can't be in two places at once, and there's only so much time in the day. And I've always loved this this kind of contradiction with good superhero stories, with real, meaty human drama superhero stories, where you have to be selfish in order to be selfless. I think that's so interesting. Like I was talking about earlier, Superman can't not have a personal life, or he's not going to appreciate the people he's saving. He's not going to care about human beings. He's going to get cold and emotionless if he doesn't put himself first to some degree. Like it's kind of the physical health thing where you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of someone else. If you let yourself go, you're not going to be any use to anybody. And so if you're sick, you got to get better before you try to take care of children or go back to your job or whatever it is. And I think Superman has that. I think if Superman, and this sounds cynical, but I think it's true, if Superman doesn't let some people die, and I don't mean when he's standing there just watching them, be on fire, or, let Zod heat vision them to death, but if he doesn't acknowledge that he can't save everyone, and doesn't spend all of his time trying to take care of every single problem there is on Earth, he's going to lose himself. And so he has to be selfish to some degree to be selfless. Now, again, I don't know if there are a lot of great stories to tell over and over again ongoing with that. That could get real stagnant. You could get to a place where you're kind of just saying the same thing over and over again. But I've always loved Batman as a character who refuses to change. And we do kind of say the same thing over and over again with Batman, but there are a lot of great stories that are ultimately kind of saying the same thing, but, finding new ways to say it, mixing it up. And, Batman, Bruce Wayne is a guy who could let the madness overtake him, but he never does, or in most Batman stories, he doesn't do that, and he refuses to kill, and he refuses to let himself go down the darkest path, and he's constantly walking that line where he has to be he has to be dark to do his job, but he's and he so easily could become the psychopaths that he's fighting, but he refuses to cross that line. And I think Superman is also interesting as a character who refuses to change, where there's a line he won't cross. He won't cross that totalitarian line, and he won't let himself not be a man in favor of being a god. I think all of that can be really interesting, and so I think you can tell stories about a super powerful Superman, but they gotta be more talky. These aren't real action-driven stories. And this is where I want to get into different kinds of Superman stories. I think it's also really interesting that so many of the most beloved Superman stories, like All-Star Superman, do all of these at once. There's a lot of kind of vignette pieces and things that just have chapters that want to hit every big kind of Superman story, and it feels like we sometimes do that for almost like the opposite of what the truth is with this. It's so interesting where it's like, we're afraid Superman isn't versatile, but because there are so many different kinds of stories that you can tell with Superman, he actually is really versatile. But we want to see all of those different flavors of it kind of at once. So you don't get a whole lot of great Superman stories that are just reporter Clark Kent because of expectations, right? People expect to see Superman punching something or getting hit by bullets and them bouncing off, and they expect an action thing. But Superman stories don't have to always be action things, and I think maybe they're often better when they aren't. And so you have the Clark Kent being a reporter story where, kind of like Detective Comic Superman, right? He's an investigative reporter. He's trying to figure something out. He's doing it on a human level, and he's using his powers as a last resort. Kind of the Zordon Power Rangers thing, where like he only uses his powers when there is no other choice. And then you have the big cosmic Superman stories where he's in space or something, or there's like an alien invasion, there's a threat from space, and he's got to use his powers because there's a big external force that is as great, as his powers. And then you have the Superman romance stories with Lois Lane, because Superman can be a very romantic character. And so, like, a lot of these things all certainly can go together, but I think it's interesting that we don't do more street level stories with Superman. It seems like there's a lot of things that try to do both. You get big cosmic things that mix in some of that street level stuff, or you get street level stuff where Superman does seem too powerful and it's mostly external conflict and it's difficult to really, appreciate what you're looking at. So anyway, So I said earlier that I think that there are kind of three big reasons that people think that Superman is difficult to write. So one of them is Superman is too powerful. Another one is Superman is unrelatable, like I was talking about before. We touched on that a lot, but let me hit this again in talking about the ideal, right? People say Superman is too perfect. He's difficult to write because he can't make mistakes. Wrong! Untrue! Good Superman stories are handled like, at least with an internal logic, or excuse me, you should have that too, with an internal conflict. Good Superman stories are handled like Winter Soldier, which I know I bring up all the time, but I've always said that Winter Soldier is the best Superman movie never made, because you have a Captain America in that movie who is constantly being tempted to do the wrong thing and to compromise his values. And that's how you tell a good Superman story. And this is why you can do a dark Superman story as long as Superman is the thing that is not dark, which I've also said a lot, but I think it bears repeating. Makes Superman a mortal man who refuses to change, and that he insists on continuing to be the ideal, but it is hard. And maybe have times where he to some degree fails. I mean, you can't go too far with that, or maybe he stops being Superman, or he loses his credibility. But you can tempt Clark Kent. You can make it difficult for him to live up to the I almost said mask, but I mean, in a way, the mask of Superman, the facade of Superman that he's created. I make this mistake a lot where I'll say that, and maybe there's still a little bit of truth to it, where I'll say that Clark Kent and Superman are the same person in a way that Batman and Bruce Wayne are not. I stand by that in the sense that Clark Kent, as the man, believes in all the values that Superman does, and Batman, or at least a lot of versions, and my favorite versions of Batman, thinks of himself as Batman first and uses Bruce Wayne as the facade. And Bruce Wayne can be a punching bag, and he can be, whatever Batman needs him to be. He doesn't have to have any values. And so in that way, Superman and Clark Kent are the same person. But I think Eric is right when he says, and he and I have had this conversation a lot, that Clark Kent is the man and Superman is the ideal that he creates. And that's this facade that he puts on where he has to pretend to be perfect to give people something to strive for, to give people a bar. And that's part of why I say Superman can be a really tragic character, because it is impossible to live up to that all the time. And it's unfair to ask anybody to. And yet Superman does it because he feels like he's the only one who can, and his powers allow him to do that. And so you just like Superman doesn't have to be too perfect, or Clark Kent doesn't have to be too perfect. Superman is supposed to look perfect, and you just again tell stories with an internal conflict about how difficult it is to live up to that. And I think you can tell really character-driven, really moody, really sometimes they don't have to all be sad, but really sad stories where Superman has put too much on his shoulders. And I also think that's a really interesting juxtaposition. When you have a guy that is that powerful, who's supposed to be able to handle everything, who can't because he is a person, he is a human being, just like you and me, and so. I don't think Superman is too perfect. I think that that's a misnomer. I think people have this idea that if Clark Kent and Superman make any mistakes at all, they're not Superman. That's not fair. That's not true. And then you get into that Star Trek Gene Roddenberry problem, right? Where characters in Star Trek The Next Generation early on, and to some degree all the way through, weren't really allowed to have interpersonal conflict with each other on the ship, because Gene Roddenberry had this idealized sense of his optimistic future, and everybody gets along now and there is no conflict. Okay, well that's a nice thought, but it doesn't make for good drama. It doesn't make for good storytelling. How are we supposed to tell stories with those kinds of constraints? And Superman can have that same problem if you, in my opinion, mistakenly think that Superman is not Superman if he makes mistakes. I don't want a Man of Steel Superman who seems to only care about Lois Lane and nobody else, and is tragic to the point of being almost scary, where he could turn into a totalitarian dictator at any point. I don't want that Superman, but he can and should be flawed. And this is why I say I think you can make a really relatable Superman. And so this idea that Superman is outdated, he is too old of an idea, because we don't believe that it is possible for a person to be that perfect, I think it's kind of silly. I think it's unfair, because he shouldn't be perfect. He's putting on the air of perfection. And again, I think Superman even publicly can occasionally make mistakes, and he's trying really hard not to. This is a character who's too hard on himself. This is the way in which a flawed Superman is really interesting to me, where maybe he actually could get away with letting people see his vulnerabilities and still being, to some degree, the ideal to strive for, because he's saying, look, I'm just like you. I mean, yeah, I can fly and I got heat vision and super breath and all of that, but I'm just like you in that I have the same personal hang-ups you do, and I have the same temptations, and I make mistakes and I screw up sometimes, but I also am always there for you when you need me. But he thinks that he has to look perfect in order to create that ideal, and maybe that's part of the inherent flaw in Superman, and I think that can be really interesting. And I think the third reason that people think that Superman is really difficult to write is very much related to the second, which is outdatedness, but in a different way. The regular status quo of Superman is hard to pull off now because it's almost 100 years old. Superman started in 1938 during a period that looked very different from ours. And I know a lot of you guys know what I'm about to say. One of the big problems is we don't have metropolitan newspapers exactly the way we did back then. And you have to update things to some degree in order to make Superman believable. But the problem is, and this is the catch-22, is for people to relate to these stories and for them to seem relevant now, unless you just make everything a period piece with Superman. In order to make it feel relevant in 2019, 2020, you have to reinvent things, and you have to create a different status quo. But it seems that comics don't, with Superman and a lot of other characters, don't tend to sell as well, at least in the long term, if we don't get back to traditions very quickly. Like, New Krypton was like this. That was a very different status quo, but I think that grabbed people because the politics of it were interesting, the kind of tactical stuff with Zod, like military tactics and the kind of regal politics and things, but that's not a thing that you could sustain forever. At the end of the day, people, or at least this is the perception. I don't know how true this even is, but it seems to be that people that are going to read Superman, that have for a long time, want to get back to the newspaper office, and they want Perry White, and they want Lois Lane either dating or married to Clark Kent, and they want Jimmy Olsen and all of that. And I do think that's a catch-22. I'm not totally sure what to do with that. This is, again, I think why reboots with Superman are popular, whether we keep going with them or whether they're a one-off story. Should we keep trying to keep Superman steeped in his old traditions, or should we, like Spider-Man keeps trying to do, finally move on from it? I don't know. It's a good question. That is the most difficult part for me. But I do think that regardless of, like as long as you don't go back to the traditional Superman status quo, and this is what a lot of people do, and just don't do anything interesting and compelling with it, where you're like, okay, this is what a Superman story is supposed to look like, and it's dime a dozen, and you just kind of recycle episodes from the black and white George Reeves series, you can do that or not do that, and I think you might be able to get people on board. Like, Snyder said when he made Man of Steel that he wanted to make Superman cool again. And my response to that has always been, if you don't think Superman is cool, you shouldn't make a Superman story. I don't think you have to make Superman cool, but I think you might have to win people over on why he's cool. I think there are people who don't get the inherent coolness, the things that are inherently interesting about Superman, and you have to find ways to win them over. And so this, the traditional status quo thing with Superman is difficult. I think you can make that work, but I also don't think you have to have it. I think what inherently makes Superman is his ideals. The basic backstory. He's got to be an alien from another planet who was sent here by his parents as the ultimate immigrant. You have to have that. And he's got to try to be actually heroic, and he can have problems, he can have flaws, but he also has to be selfless. Those are the things that make Superman Superman. Everything else is negotiable. You can do really anything you want to with Superman, and that's the ultimate irony with this to me, is that I think Superman is, in being kind of the original ultimate superhero, it's such a broad, simple idea that it's completely versatile, and there's a bazillion things you can do with it. He, just like Batman, can be done in a lot of different ways. It can be comedic, it can be dramatic, it can be really heady, it can be really light and escapist, and yet not a lot of people have written great Superman stories. Especially lately, especially in the modern day. And it's really sad that Bendis hasn't seemed to be able to pull it off. And I haven't read that lately, but I didn't care what I read of it at the beginning. And so I sympathize with writers that have trouble with this because I think a lot of, maybe this is the fourth thing, that a lot of the problem is expectation. A lot of people have their own idea of what a Superman story is supposed to look like, and I think people get in trouble when they think too much about what the reaction, what the reception is going to be, instead of just telling a story and winning people over on your Superman. So if you get in a rut where you say, I have to make my Superman perfect because that's what people expect, that's what Superman is supposed to be, I think you're nailing your coffin down before you've even gotten started. So anyway, leave your comments. Let me know what you guys think about the notion that Superman is one of the hardest things to write. Can you think of any other ideas of why Superman might be difficult? Do you think, like me, that Superman actually is really versatile and can be really, really compelling and relatable, regardless of the fact that he has more powers, that he's so, I almost said more powers than we do. Yes, anybody with powers has more powers than we do. But like, think about the fact that there are lots and lots of characters with superpowers and with almost as who are almost as powerful as Superman, like say Martian Manhunter, who we're not as worried about this with. And why is that? And I think it's because, I meant to say this earlier, that we look at Superman as an ideal before we look at him as a character. We look at him as a symbol. And I think that gets people into trouble too. Maybe that is ultimately, okay, that's the fifth thing. I think that is ultimately the thing that makes Superman the hardest to write, is that it's like writing stories about Jesus every week. He is, or every month or whatever, he's thought of as an idea before he's thought of as a character. And you got to do what JMS did, what he started to do with Grounded years ago, which was a great idea that ultimately fell apart because he got sick and wasn't able to keep writing it. And then what he did with Earth 1, which is you make a story about a man who is thought of as an idea. And by the way, it's exactly what we do with Batman. More successfully, more often. Why is that? Why is it easier to do with the dark urban legend character than it is with the optimistic ideal character? Is it just as simple? Is it this superficial that we think of the world as darker and more cynical and more oppressive now than we did when Superman first came into being, and so it's easier to swallow stories about Batman than it is Superman? Is that all it is? And if it is, and this is gonna make me sound sappy, but if it is, yeah, we need good Superman stories now more than we ever have. Anyway, leave your comments. I'm excited to read them. Thanks a lot for watching my very scatterbrained video, and I will see you again next time. Bye, folks.